Grace Miller pressed both palms flat against that diner counter and made herself breathe. The whole room had gone quiet. Every single customer people she had served coffee to for 6 years, people whose children she had remembered by name, sat there watching while the owner pointed at the door and said it loud enough for God himself to hear, "A woman your size is bad for my business, Grace. Clean out your locker." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. That silence told Grace everything she had always feared about this town was absolutely true. Before this story goes any further, if Grace's strength already has something stirring in your chest, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single part of what happens next. And drop your city down in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go all the way back to where it truly began. Grace Miller had been waking up at 4:30 in the morning for 6 years straight, without a single day off that she chose for herself. Every morning, she was out of bed before the sun touched the flat Texas horizon, pulling on her uniform in the dark, so she wouldn't wake her mother, whose coughing had started again the week before and hadn't stopped. She would put a glass of water and 2 white pills on the nightstand, press her lips to her mother's forehead, and walk the 3/4 of a mile to the sundown diner in whatever heat that particular morning decided to throw at her. Millhaven, Texas, was not a forgiving town in July. It was not a forgiving town in any month if you want to know the truth. But July had a particular cruelty to it, the kind of heat that didn't just sit on you, but pressed into your lungs and dared you to breathe. The sundown diner sat at the edge of the main road running through town, a squat building with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered, and Grace had memorized every crack in the sidewalk between her front door and the diner's back entrance. She liked the back entrance. The back entrance was quieter. "Morning, Grace?" That was Delia, the other morning waitress, already tying her apron when Grace pushed through the kitchen door. Delia was thin and fast and kind, in the way some women are kind genuinely, without thinking about it, and she was the only person in that building Grace truly trusted. "Morning." Grace hung up her bag and reached for her apron. "How's the grill looking?" "Roy burned the first batch of biscuits again. Don't tell him I told you." "I never tell him anything." That was the rhythm of the sundown diner at 4:45 in the morning. And Grace moved through it the way she moved through everything, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to herself. She knew exactly which table wobbled and needed a folded napkin under the leg. She knew which of the regulars took their coffee black and which ones wanted cream before you even asked. She knew that the booth in the far corner got a draft from the broken AC unit and that old Mr. Patterson preferred it there even in winter because his knees swelled in the heat. She knew all of it. She had paid attention to all of it for 6 years because paying attention to other people was the one thing Grace Miller had always done exceptionally well. What she had never been good at, what she had never once successfully figured out, was making other people pay attention to her in a way that didn't hurt. By 6 in the morning, the diner was filling up. Ranch hands came in from the east side of town, smelling of dust and livestock, dropping their hats on the hooks by the door. Couples from the newer developments on the north end drove in for breakfast, looking put together and clean. And then, there were the regulars from the Hayes Ranch. Walter Hayes's people, the foremen and the managers who ran the day-to-day operations of the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, who always took the long table by the window and ordered enough food for twice their number. "Hey there, Big Grace." That was Carson Webb, one of Hayes's foremen, not saying it mean exactly, but not saying it kindly either. Just saying it the way you say a thing that you've said so many times it stopped registering as anything other than a fact. The usual. Grace didn't flinch. She had stopped flinching at that name sometime in year 2. Coffee first or after? During. He grinned, and the men around him laughed at something she hadn't heard, and Grace wrote down the orders and moved on. That was the game. Move on. Keep moving. Don't stop long enough for it to settle into you. She was refilling the coffee station behind the counter when she heard the bell above the front door. She didn't look up immediately. The bell rang 40 or 50 times a morning, but something made her look when she normally wouldn't have. Maybe it was the way the room shifted slightly. The way conversations didn't stop exactly, but softened. The way Carson Webb sat up a little straighter at the long table. Walter Hayes walked through the front door of the Sundown Diner at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning in July, and Grace Miller's first thought was that he was older than she expected. She had seen him from a distance. Everyone in Millhaven had seen Walter Hayes from a distance at one point or another at the 4th of July parade at the county fair outside the bank in his good hat. He was the kind of man a town like Millhaven organized itself around without entirely meaning to. His family had owned land in this county for 4 generations. His name was on the library wing on the hospital corridor on the plaque outside the volunteer fire station. Walter Hayes was not a man who walked into the Sundown Diner for breakfast, and yet there he was. He was tall, even now, even with the slight bend age had put in his shoulders. His face was deeply lined, the face of a man who had spent the better part of 80 years outdoors. He wore a plain gray shirt, work boots, and a hat he took off as soon as he crossed the threshold, an automatic gesture of courtesy so practiced it had become part of his body. He looked around the diner without hurry. His eyes moved across the room the way an old cattleman's eyes move across a pasture taking inventory, reading the land. Then his gaze landed on Grace behind the counter, and he walked directly toward her. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "I'll sit at the counter if that's all right." Grace had the coffee pot in her hand. She set it down. "Of course. Anywhere you like." He took the stool directly in front of her and set his hat on the one beside it, crowned down the way you do when you respect a hat. "What can I get you?" Grace asked. "Coffee black, and whatever you think's worth eating this morning." He said it simply without flourish, and looked at her in a way that she immediately recognized as rare, not past her, not through her, but directly at her. "You'd know better than me what's good." "Biscuits are fresh," Grace said. "Eggs are good. Roy does a solid piece of ham." "That'll do fine." She poured the coffee and went to put in the order, and when she came back he was looking out the window at the road. The men at the long table had gone back to their conversation, though she could feel their awareness of Hayes like a change in air pressure. "You're Grace Miller," Hayes said when she set the coffee in front of him. She paused. "I am." "Dorothy Miller's daughter." "Yes, sir. I knew your father," he said. Briefly. "Good man." Grace's chest did something complicated. Nobody in this town spoke about her father. "He was," she said carefully. Hayes nodded once as if confirming something to himself and wrapped both hands around the mug. His hands were enormous, the hands of a man who had built things with them, fixed things, held things together by force of will. They didn't speak much after that. Grace had other tables, other orders, other needs to attend to. But she noticed that Hayes ate slowly and without complaint, and that he watched the room the same way she did, with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that watching carefully costs you nothing and occasionally saves you everything. He was finishing his coffee when it happened. Grace had stepped outside the back door for 45 seconds, just 45 seconds to put a box of flattened cardboard into the recycling when she heard the boy. He was maybe 9 years old, thin, in the way children are thin when they haven't been eating properly, sitting against the brick wall of the diner in the sliver of shadow it threw in the early morning. His shoes were wrong for the season, and he had a paper cup in his hand that someone must have given him, holding it with both hands, the way you hold something precious. Grace looked at him. He looked at her with eyes that had already learned not to ask. "You hungry?" she said. He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded small and quick, as if agreeing too enthusiastically might make the offer disappear. "Come on then," Grace said. "Back door. I'll fix you a plate." She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where his parents were or how long he'd been sitting there. She went inside, fixed a plate of eggs and biscuits and ham, poured a glass of cold milk, and brought it out to him. She sat down on the back step beside him and stayed there while he ate, not talking, just present, in the way that sometimes presence is the only real thing you can offer a person. She didn't know that Walter Hayes had gotten up from his stool at the counter and moved to the side window. She didn't know he was watching. When she came back inside, she went straight to the coffee station because table 4 needed a refill, and she didn't notice Hayes standing just to the left of the kitchen door until he spoke. "How often do you do that?" he asked. Grace looked at him. "Sir." "The boy. How often does that happen?" She thought about how to answer that. "Often enough that I keep track of what's left at the end of a shift," she said finally. Hayes studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the stool, took his wallet from his back pocket, and left $40 on the counter for a $12 meal. He put his hat on. He nodded at her, not with the automatic politeness he'd used when he walked in, but with something more deliberate, something that felt like the beginning of a decision. "Good morning, Miss Grace," he said. And he walked out. She stood there for a moment, looking at the $40. Then Delia appeared beside her. Was that actually Walter Hayes? It was. "What did he want?" "Breakfast," Grace said, and she picked up her coffee pot and went back to work. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the 4th day, Carson Webb had stopped calling her Big Grace at the long table and had switched to something worse. A silence that communicated contempt more efficiently than any name. By the end of the first week, the story had circulated through every corner of Millhaven. Walter Hayes was eating breakfast at the Sundown Diner every single morning, and he sat at Grace Miller's counter and he talked to her. The town did not know what to make of this, so it did what small towns do when confronted with something they don't understand. It made it ugly. "She's working him," Grace overheard at the pharmacy while waiting for her mother's prescription. The voice belonged to Patricia Webb Carson's wife, standing one aisle over with a friend whose name Grace didn't know. "A woman like that, she knows exactly what she's doing. Poor man's lonely since Eleanor passed," the friend said. "These women can smell that from a mile away." Grace stood very still. She kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her and made herself breathe. "I heard she brings him food," Patricia continued. "Extra portions, like fattening up a calf before market." They laughed. The pharmacy was not a large building. There was nowhere for the sound to go except directly into Grace. She paid for the prescription. She walked out. She did not cry until she was past the parking lot, past the feed store, past the intersection, where the old Miller Hardware sign still hung above the building her father had sold 30 years ago, to pay off a debt that Grace at 8 years old had not understood and had spent the rest of her life learning the shape of. She did not cry for long. She couldn't afford to. Walter Hayes came in the next morning at 6:17 as usual. He sat at the counter. He asked for coffee black. He waited while she poured it, and when she set the mug in front of him, he looked at her with those direct eyes of his and said, "You look like you had a hard day yesterday." "I've had worse," Grace said. "I don't doubt it." He wrapped his hands around the mug. People talking. She almost deflected. It was her first instinct: always deflect, minimize, move on. But something in the directness of the question stopped her. "Some," she said. He nodded as if this was information he had already calculated. "Let them," he said. "People who don't have enough of their own business to mind never run out of opinions about other people's." Grace almost smiled. That's either very wise or very convenient. "Can't it be both?" He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved, and Grace realized with some surprise that Walter Hayes had a sense of humor buried under all that weathered gravity. "You got time to sit for a minute after the rush." "I'm working." "I know that. I mean after." She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because." He said, "I'd like to talk to someone who isn't trying to get something from me. And I think you might be the only person in this county who fits that description right now." It was such a plain thing to say. Such a simply, plainly honest thing. Grace stood there with the coffee pot in her hand, and she thought about Patricia Webb and the pharmacy and the $40 he'd left on the counter, and she thought about her mother's cough and the stack of bills on the kitchen table and the boy with the paper cup. "I get a 15-minute break at 9, she said. He nodded. "I'll wait." That 15 minutes turned into 25 because Roy needed help with a backed-up order, and Delia's tables ran over, and Grace was sure that Hayes would have left by the time she finally came around the counter and sat down across from him in the small booth at the back that nobody ever wanted because of the draft. He hadn't left. He was sitting there with a second cup of coffee, looking out the window at the road, perfectly patient in the way that men who have genuinely made peace with time tend to be patient. "Sorry," she said, sliding into the booth. "Don't apologize," he said. "You were working. That's not something to apologize for." She didn't know how to respond to that exactly, so she didn't. She folded her hands on the table and waited. "You know who I am," he said. "Yes, sir." "So you know I've got money?" "Yes, sir." "And you know that makes people in this town see me in a particular way?" "I suppose it does." He looked at the table. "My wife Eleanor passed 14 months ago. We were married 51 years, had 3 children together, built that ranch from about 60 head of cattle to what it is now." He paused. "You'd think 51 years would leave you with enough company to fill the quiet." Grace said nothing. She was listening. "But my children are busy," Hayes continued. "They've got their lives, their own things. They come out to the ranch at holidays, call on birthdays. That's fine. That's how it should be, I suppose." He turned the mug slowly on the table. "What I didn't expect was how loud the ranch gets when there's nobody in it." "Loud," Grace said. "Sounds strange, I know, but quiet has its own sound when it's not a quiet you chose." He looked at her. "You know what I mean." Grace thought about 4:45 in the morning, in a dark kitchen, placing pills on a nightstand, for a woman who barely stirred anymore. She thought about the walk to the diner in a town that had never once made room for her in any conversation that mattered. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. Something shifted in Walter Hayes's face. Something that had been held there by habit and dignity and decades of controlling what he let show went quiet and easy just for a moment. "I thought you might," he said. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures or sudden revelations, not with money or promises or any of the things that the town of Millhaven would construct from nothing and pass around like currency over the weeks that followed. It began with a 15-minute break that ran 25 and 2 people sitting across a wobbly table in a back booth that got too much draft talking about what silence sounds like when it isn't yours. Grace did not tell anyone about the conversation. Delia noticed something because Delia always noticed everything, and she raised her eyebrows at Grace over the counter at 9:45. Grace shook her head. Delia let it go. Hayes came back every morning. The conversations at the counter stayed short. Weather, coffee, the occasional dry observation about someone's behavior in the parking lot that made Grace press her lips together to keep from laughing. But twice more that week, he stayed until her break, and twice more, they sat in the back booth, and Grace found herself saying things she had not said out loud since her father died. She told him about the debt. Not all of it, not in detail, but enough the medical bills from her mother's first hospitalization, the loan she'd taken to keep the house the way the interest had compounded, past the point where she could quite see the other side of it anymore. She said it flatly, the way you state facts when the facts have been sitting on you long enough that you've stopped feeling the weight. Hayes listened without interrupting. Then he said, "What would you do if it was gone? The debt. All of it. The whole weight of it. What would you do the next morning?" Grace hadn't been asked that before. She thought about it seriously. "Sleep past 4:30, she said. He almost laughed. "And after that, I'd take my mother somewhere she's never been," Grace said slowly. "Somewhere green. She grew up in East Tennessee. She talks about the trees sometimes the way they looked in fall. She hasn't been back in 40 years. "Why not?" "Because I couldn't afford to take her and she wouldn't go without me." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "She sounds stubborn. The stubbornest woman in Texas, possibly in North America." "You come by it honestly then." Grace blinked. Then she sat back and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, she laughed. It wasn't a performance of a laugh. It wasn't the polite sound she made when customers said something they thought was funny. It was a real laugh, brief and surprised, and fully her own, and it filled the back booth of the Sundown Diner at 9:52 on a Thursday morning, and Walter Hayes looked at her when it happened, with an expression that was almost reverent. "You should do that more," he said. "Laugh, yes." "Not much call for it around here," she said, and the laugh faded back into the ordinary texture of her face. "There should be," Hayes said, and the way he said it simply with the absolute certainty of a man who had lived long enough to know what mattered, landed in Grace's chest and stayed there. Outside the diner, the summer pressed against the windows. Inside, Carson Webb's table had been watching the back booth for the better part of 20 minutes, and every man at that table had already decided on the story they would carry home. They had looked at Grace Miller and looked at Walter Hayes, and assembled from those two images the only narrative a town like Millhaven knew how to build: a woman taking advantage of an old man's loneliness. A body like hers, reaching for something it had no right to. A situation that needed correcting before it went too far. None of them asked what was actually said in that booth. None of them ever would. Grace tied her apron back on and went to table 6, and Walter Hayes left $40 on the counter again and put on his hat and walked out into the July heat. And the door of the sundown diner swung shut behind him with the sound of that buzzing neon sign overhead. Delia appeared beside Grace at the coffee station. "People are going to talk," she said quietly. "People are already talking," Grace said. "I mean worse." "I know." Delia looked at her. "You okay with that?" Grace picked up the coffee pot. She thought about 4:45 in the morning. She thought about pills on a nightstand, and the boy with the paper cup, and 51 years of marriage, and the sound of a silence that isn't yours. She thought about a man who had looked directly at her, not past her, not through her, and asked what she would do if the weight was gone. "I'm okay with a lot of things," she said. "I've had practice." She walked to table 6 and refilled the coffee, and the summer burned on outside, and in the corners of the sundown diner, the whispers were already building into something that would take on a life of its own, long before either Grace Miller or Walter Hayes had any idea what was truly coming. The whispers didn't stay whispers for long. By the second week of Walter Hayes's morning visits, the sundown diner had become the most talked-about building in Millhaven. Grace felt it the moment she walked through the back door each morning, a tension in the air that wasn't there before, a particular kind of quiet that fell over certain tables when she moved past them. She had spent 6 years learning to be invisible in this town, and now she couldn't cross the room without feeling a dozen pairs of eyes tracking her like she was something that needed to be watched. She kept moving. That was what she did. She kept moving. On a Wednesday morning, 12 days after Hayes first sat at her counter, Grace was carrying a loaded tray to table 3 when Patricia Webb stepped directly into her path. Grace stopped. The tray didn't tip. She had good hands, always had. "I'd like a word," Patricia said. "I'm working, Mrs. Webb. This won't take long." Patricia's voice was the particular kind of pleasant that is not pleasant at all, the kind that has a blade inside it. She was dressed for church, though it was Wednesday, and there was no church on Wednesday, which told Grace that this conversation was something she had planned and prepared for. "Walter Hayes has a family, Grace. A real family. Children, grandchildren, people who love him." "I'm sure he does," Grace said. "Then you understand that what you're doing, whatever this is not something that goes unnoticed." Grace looked at her steadily. "I serve him breakfast, Mrs. Webb. Same as I serve your husband and every other person who walks through that door." "You do considerably more than serve him breakfast, and everyone in this town knows it." "Then everyone in this town is wrong." Grace stepped around her. "Excuse me, this food's getting cold." She set the tray down at table 3 with perfectly steady hands, and she did not look back at Patricia Webb, and she did not let herself process what had just happened until she was behind the counter with her back to the room and the coffee station in front of her, and something solid beneath her hands. Delia appeared beside her. "You all right?" "Fine." "You're gripping that handle hard enough to bend it." Grace loosened her fingers. "I'm fine," she said again, quieter this time. And then, because Delia was the only person she trusted, "How bad is it?" Delia was quiet for a moment. That was answer enough. Hayes arrived at 6:17 as usual. He sat down at the counter, put his hat on the next stool, and looked at Grace with those direct eyes and said, "You look like someone took a run at you this morning." Patricia Webb. He didn't look surprised. He wrapped his hands around the mug she'd already set in front of him. What did she say? The polite version of mind your own business before something gets broken. And the impolite version, that you have a family and I'm taking advantage of your loneliness and everyone in town knows it. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what did you tell her?" "That I serve you breakfast same as anyone else." "That's true," he said, "and also not the whole truth." Grace looked at him. "No," she admitted. "It's not." He nodded once. "Patricia Webb has been trying to manage other people's business since the 2nd grade. I know this because I went to school with her mother who had the same habit." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Don't let her make you small, Miss Grace. She's had enough practice at that, and she doesn't need your help." It was such a simple thing, but it landed somewhere deep and stayed there. The bell above the door rang at 7:45, and Grace didn't look up from the order she was writing until the voice reached her, and the voice was wrong. Not a regular, not a ranch hand. Something that carried money and impatience and the particular edge of someone who was not accustomed to waiting. "I'm looking for my father." Grace looked up. The man standing at the host station was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, wearing a collared shirt that was too clean for a Tuesday morning in Millhaven. He had Hayes's jaw and none of Hayes's patience. His eyes moved around the diner and landed on Grace with an expression she recognized immediately: assessment, followed by a decision already made before the assessment was finished. "Mr. Hayes left about an hour ago," Grace said. "He comes here every day." It wasn't a question. "He does. And you're the one who serves him." Again, not a question. A verdict. "I am." The man walked to the counter. He sat down on the stool where Hayes's hat usually rested, and he put both hands flat on the surface, the way people do when they want to communicate that they are taking up this space intentionally. "I'm Richard Hayes," he said. "Walter's son." "Grace Miller. I know who you are." He looked at her for a moment. "My father is 81 years old, Miss Miller. He lost his wife 14 months ago. He's not in the clearest state of mind right now. Grief does things to people." "Your father seems very clear-minded to me," Grace said. "Of course he does. That's part of the problem." Richard Hayes leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to be very direct with you." "I'd appreciate that. Whatever friendship you think you've built with my father, it's not real. He's a lonely old man, and you're a woman in a difficult financial situation, and those two things together make for a story I've seen before." He paused. "I'm not accusing you of anything specific. I'm asking you very politely to let him be." The diner was not full yet. The few people present were absolutely still, the way people go still when they're trying to hear something without appearing to try. Grace put down her pen. She looked at Richard Hayes for a long moment, and something inside her that had been folded down small and careful for 6 years straightened up to its full height. "Your father comes here because he wants to," she said. "He's a grown man, and that's his decision to make, not mine and not yours. I'm not going to turn him away because his family is uncomfortable." She picked her pen back up. "Can I get you some coffee?" Richard Hayes stared at her. He hadn't expected that. Whatever he'd expected, apology deference, a woman who would fold under a little pressure, he hadn't expected that. He stood up. "This isn't over," he said. "I didn't think it was," Grace said pleasantly. "Have a good morning, Mr. Hayes." He left. Delia let out a long breath from somewhere behind the coffee station. Grace wrote down an order she hadn't taken yet just to give her hands something to do, and her heart was hammering so loud she was half convinced the people at table 2 could hear it. But her hands were steady. They were always steady. She didn't tell Hayes about Richard's visit. She meant to. She turned it over in her mind through the morning shift and into the early afternoon. But when Hayes came back the next day and looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention of his, she found she didn't want to spend the 15 minutes of her break adding weight to his morning. He had enough weight already. She could see it in the way he held himself in the pauses that opened up sometimes in the middle of a sentence, like a man who has started down a familiar road and suddenly can't remember where it goes. "You don't talk much about your health," she said to him one morning 10 days later. It came out more directly than she'd planned. Hayes looked at her over the rim of his mug. "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Are you sick?" A pause. Not the pause of a man deciding whether to lie, but the pause of a man deciding how much truth to carry into a conversation. "I've got something in my heart that the doctors are watching," he said finally. "Has been there about 8 months. Could be another 5 years, could be considerably less. They're not sure, and I've stopped asking them to guess." He set the mug down. "Doesn't change much about how I spend a Tuesday morning." Grace absorbed this. "Does Richard know?" Hayes looked at her sharply. Then something shifted in his expression. "He told you he came here. He didn't have to. It was written all over the conversation." She met his eyes. "Does he know?" "He knows enough." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "My children know I'm not a young man, Grace. They know things have a horizon. What they don't know, what they never manage to understand, is that a horizon is not the same thing as an ending." She thought about that for the rest of the shift. The following Thursday, Hayes didn't come at his usual time. 6:17 came and went. 6:30. 7. Grace refilled coffee and took orders and kept one part of her attention on the front door in a way she hadn't done for anyone in a very long time, and told herself this was not concern. This was just the awareness of a changed routine. By 7:45, she had stopped telling herself that. At 8:03, Hayes walked through the front door. He moved differently than usual, slower with a deliberate quality to each step, and his color was off in a way she couldn't name precisely, but recognized immediately as wrong. He sat at the counter, and she had a glass of water in front of him before he'd taken his hat off. "I'm all right," he said, reading her face. "You don't look all right. I had a rough night." He reached for the water. His hand wasn't entirely steady. "This happens sometimes. I know what it is. Should you be here?" "Probably not." He almost smiled. "But I didn't want to be at the ranch." Grace looked at him for a moment. "Give me 5 minutes." She went to the back, told Roy she was taking an early break, told Delia she'd cover her last 2 tables after, and came back around the counter. She sat down across from Hayes in the back booth and folded her hands on the table. "Talk," she said. He looked at her. "About what?" "Whatever kept you up last night." And he did. He talked about Eleanor, about the particular cruelty of a grief that doesn't diminish with time, but simply changes its shape, finding new corners of your life to occupy when you thought you'd accounted for all of them. He talked about waking up at 3 in the morning to the silence and reaching instinctively for a person who had been there for 51 years and was not there anymore. He talked about his children arriving at the ranch after the funeral and spending 3 days organizing his finances and his will and his estate planning as if he were already gone and then leaving. And the ranch being so quiet, he'd stood in the kitchen for 40 minutes one morning just listening to the clock. He talked, and Grace listened, and outside the July sun climbed higher, and the diner filled up, and Delia covered her tables with practiced efficiency, and not one person in that building who was watching the back booth understood what they were actually seeing. "I need to show you something," Hayes said when the conversation found its natural end. "Out at the ranch. Not today, you're working, and I need a day where I'm not half dead on my feet. But soon." "What is it?" "Something Eleanor left. Something I've been trying to figure out what to do with for 14 months. He looked at her. "I think you might know." Grace didn't ask him what it was. She had learned in the weeks of these conversations that Hayes was not a man you rushed. He arrived at things in his own time, and he arrived at them completely, and the waiting was always worth it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting in that back booth while Delia managed the lunch rush, and Richard Hayes was 40 miles away on the phone with a family lawyer, was that the thing Hayes wanted to show her would change the entire shape of her life. She didn't know that the conversation they just had was being described in a very different way to very different people in very different rooms across Millhaven. She didn't know that a video shaky taken on someone's phone through the diner window, catching her sitting across from Hayes in the back booth, while he wiped something from his eye, had already been posted to 3 different community Facebook pages with a caption that used the word predator. She found out about the video from Delia at 2:15 after the lunch rush had cleared and the diner was mostly empty. Delia put her phone on the counter without saying anything, and Grace looked at the screen and read the caption and the comments below it and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. "How many shares?" Grace said. "Grace? How many?" Delia hesitated. "Enough." Grace handed the phone back. She untied her apron, which was her break signal, though her break had technically been 2 hours ago. She walked to the back door and pushed it open and stood in the July heat and breathed. The boy wasn't there today. Some days he was, some days he wasn't. Today she was alone with the alley and the cardboard recycling bin and the sound of a truck passing on the main road. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Patricia Webb, about Richard Hayes and his hands flat on the counter, about 3 community Facebook pages and the word predator and the comments she hadn't let herself read past the first few. She thought about 6 years of early mornings and pills on nightstands and never quite reaching the other side of the debt. She thought about a man in a back booth, his voice going rough around the edges of a grief he was still learning to carry, who had looked at her like she was worth looking at. She went back inside. She tied her apron. She picked up a coffee pot, because that was what Grace Miller did. She kept moving. She had always kept moving. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and certain, as a thing that has been true for a long time before you name it, she understood that whatever was coming next, the lawsuits, the gossip, the family's fury, all of it, that was still just gathering itself on the horizon, she was not going to outrun it. She was going to walk directly through it. The only question was whether she was going to do it alone. She didn't know yet, but she was starting to suspect the answer. 3 days after the Facebook video, Hayes arrived at the diner at his usual time and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter beside his coffee mug without saying anything. Grace looked at it. Then she looked at him. "What's this?" "My address," he said. "Saturday morning. Come out to the ranch. 8 o'clock. I work Saturdays. I already talked to Roy." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "He said you haven't taken a Saturday off in 4 months. Grace stared at him. "You talked to my boss about my schedule." I asked him a simple question. "That is not a simple question, Mr. Hayes. That is—" "Walter," he said. He had said it before. She still hadn't made the switch. "And I know it's not simple. Nothing about this is simple. But I have something I need to show you. And I've been putting it off for 2 weeks because of what other people think. And I'm 81 years old. And I don't have the luxury of putting things off indefinitely." He held her gaze. "Saturday, 8 o'clock. Grace picked up the folded paper. She put it in her apron pocket without opening it. "I'll think about it," she said. She went on Saturday. The Hayes Ranch sat 7 miles east of Millhaven past the grain elevators and the old Patterson place down a road that turned to gravel after the 2nd mile and then to packed dirt after the 3rd. Grace drove her mother's 12-year-old Civic with the windows down because the AC had stopped working in May, and she spent most of the drive telling herself she was doing something completely reasonable, that 2 people with a friendship, because that was what it was, a friendship could exist in the same space without the entire county declaring a moral emergency. She almost believed it by the time she reached the gate. Hayes was waiting for her on the porch. He looked better than he had on Thursday, color back steadier on his feet, and he raised a hand when he saw the Civic coming up the drive. "You came," he said when she got out. "I said I'd think about it. I thought about it. And I decided that I've been afraid of what this town thinks for 6 years, and it hasn't made my life one bit easier." She looked at him. "So, what did you want to show me?" He took her around the side of the main house, past the equipment barn, to a long stretch of land that had been cleared and marked with stakes and twine in a rough grid pattern. She could see where someone had started to break ground in a few sections, and then stopped. The whole thing had the feeling of a project interrupted midway. Eleanor drew this up 2 years before she passed, Hayes said. She wanted to put in a working garden. Not decorative, functional. Vegetables, herbs, a water system. She said there were families in this county going hungry every summer, and we had the land and the well, and no good reason not to use it. He paused. She died before we broke ground. I've had the stakes and the plan sitting there for 14 months, and I can't make myself start it without knowing what to do with it once it's done. Grace looked at the marked ground. She thought about the boy with the paper cup. She thought about what she had said she would do if the weight was ever gone somewhere green, somewhere worth traveling to. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Grace said. She was the best person I ever knew, Hayes said simply. And I think she would have liked you a great deal. Grace's throat tightened. She didn't let it show. Why are you showing me this? She said. Because I want your help finishing it. He looked at her steadily. Not your money, not your time if you don't have it to spare. Just your eyes on it. Your thoughts. You know better than anyone what people around here actually need. He paused. Will you do that? She looked at the staked ground for a long moment. Show me the plans, she said. They spent 3 hours that Saturday going over Eleanor's drawings, spread across the kitchen table, while coffee went cold beside them. Grace had opinions, strong ones it turned out, about drainage and sun exposure, and what varieties of vegetables had the longest yield in Texas heat, and Hayes listened to all of them with the focused attention of a man who had spent a lifetime recognizing useful knowledge regardless of where it came from. By noon, they had revised 2 sections of the layout and identified which parts could be started in the coming weeks and which needed to wait for the worst of the summer to break. It was the most useful Grace had felt in longer than she could remember. She was at the kitchen sink, washing her hands, when Hayes said from the table behind her, "Richard called me last night." She turned off the tap. She didn't turn around right away. "He told me about coming to the diner," Hayes continued. "Told me what he said to you." "He was protecting his father. I understand that." "He was protecting his inheritance," Hayes said, and his voice had a flatness to it that she hadn't heard before, not anger exactly, but something harder. The sound of a man who has looked at a thing directly and named it without blinking. "There's a difference, and I'm sorry he spoke to you that way." Grace finally turned around. Hayes was looking at the table at Eleanor's garden plans, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Don't apologize for him," she said quietly. "I'm not. I'm apologizing for the fact that you've been made to feel like a problem to be managed, when all you've done is be decent to an old man who needed decency." He looked up at her. "That's not something you should have to defend." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back down at the table, picked up her coffee, and said, "Tell me about Eleanor. The early years, before the ranch was what it is now, and the guilt went out of his face, and the love came in, and he talked." The following Monday, Grace's phone rang at 7 in the morning, 45 minutes before her shift. It was Roy. "I need you to come in a little early," Roy said. He sounded wrong, constrained like a man reading from something he'd written and rehearsed. "I can be there in 20 minutes, Grace said. "And bring your things," Roy said. "All of them." She stood in the kitchen, in the particular silence that follows a sentence that hasn't finished landing yet. Her mother was still asleep down the hall. The pills were on the nightstand. The sun was barely up. "Roy," she said. "Grace, I'm sorry. I've got pressure from there are people the ownership group met on Friday and they—" He stopped, started again. "It's not something I have control over." "Who called them?" Silence. "Roy." "Who made the call?" "I think you know who," he said quietly. And then, "I'm real sorry, Grace. I mean that." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a full minute, not moving. Then she went and put her mother's pills out, poured a glass of water, and got dressed. She cleaned out her locker in 8 minutes. Delia was waiting by the back door and grabbed her arm before she could push through it. "Don't you leave without telling me what's happening," Delia said. I'm fired. Grace said it flatly. Pressure from the ownership group. Someone made a call. Delia's face went through several things in quick succession. That woman, she said, and she didn't say Patricia Webb's name, but she didn't need to. Probably. Grace looked at her. Don't do anything about it. Don't make it your fight. Grace. I mean it, Delia. You've got 2 kids in school and you need this job. Let it be. She pushed through the back door and then stopped, one hand still on the frame, and turned back. Thank you. For the last 6 years. For every morning. Delia's eyes were bright. That was not a goodbye. No, Grace said. It wasn't. But walking away from that diner felt like closing a door she wasn't sure she could reopen. And the July sun hit her full in the face, and she didn't have anywhere to be for the first time in 6 years. And the weight of that, the terrifying wide-open space of that pressed against her chest, the whole 1.75 miles home. She called Hayes from her kitchen table. She hadn't called him before. She'd always let him come to her. But she had his number written on the folded paper that was still in the pocket of the apron she would never put on again, and she dialed it before she could think herself out of it. He picked up on the second ring. They fired me, she said. A pause. Then, when? This morning. Roy made the call. Someone pressured the ownership group. Richard, Hayes said. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I don't know that. I do. Another pause. Are you all right? Grace looked at the kitchen table, at the stack of bills that had grown by 2 since last week, at the notepad where she'd written down the cost of her mother's next prescription. The number circled 3 times, like if she circled it enough it would change. I will be, she said. Grace. His voice was firm. Don't make any decisions today. Not about money, not about what comes next, not about any of it. Just give me 2 days. Walter, I'm not going to let you. 2 days, he said. That's all I'm asking. She didn't answer right away. Outside, a truck rumbled down her street. She could hear her mother shifting in the back bedroom, the slow sounds of waking up. 2 days, she said finally. He came to her house the next morning. He knocked on the front door at 9:30, hat in hand, and when Grace opened it, she saw his truck in the driveway, and behind him in the passenger seat, a woman with gray-streaked hair and Hayes's same jaw. Not Richard's jaw, softer with something kinder in it, who was watching the front door with an expression Grace couldn't read. My daughter Margaret, Hayes said. She drove in from Austin last night. She wants to meet you. Grace looked past him at the truck. Margaret Hayes raised a hand in a small, uncertain wave. She's not here to threaten me, Grace said. Lord, no. Margaret's the reasonable one, always has been. He said it with a weary affection that made Grace believe it. She's worried about me, and she wanted to see for herself what I've been spending my Tuesday mornings on. He looked at Grace directly. I told her you were the best person I'd met in Millhaven in 30 years. She said she'd be the judge of that. Grace stepped back from the door. You'd better come in then. Margaret Hayes was nothing like her brother. She sat at Grace's kitchen table and looked around the house with eyes that weren't calculating, but observing. And she accepted a cup of coffee and drank it without performing anything. And within 10 minutes, she was talking to Grace's mother, Dorothy, who had come out in her housecoat when she heard voices suspicious and sharp-eyed in the way women get who have spent decades protecting something they love, like they had known each other for years. Dorothy was not easy to win over. She had been watching Grace carry the weight of this town's opinion for 6 years, and it had made her fierce. But Margaret told a story about Hayes at some point, a story about him driving 40 miles in a snowstorm to bring feed to a neighbor whose truck had broken down, refusing any payment, furious when the man tried, and Dorothy laughed. Actually laughed. And the sound of it stopped Grace in the middle of the kitchen. Hayes, sitting beside Grace, said quietly, I haven't heard her laugh in a while. No, Grace admitted. You haven't. She sounds like you, he said. When you forget to hold it in. Grace looked at him. He was looking at her mother with an expression she had come to recognize as the way he looked at things he found genuinely good in the world, steady and appreciative and a little sorrowful, the way you look at beautiful things when you know time moves. "Walter," she said low enough that only he could hear, "what's happening with your heart?" He was quiet. "Don't protect me from it," she said. "We're past that." He set down his coffee cup. "The doctors moved the conversation from watching to managing last week," he said. "There's a difference in those words that I'm still working through." Grace's chest hurt. "How much time?" "They won't say months anymore." His voice was even, resigned in the way of a man who has made his peace, but still feels the weight of the peace he's made. "They say weeks can't be ruled out." She sat very still. The sound of Dorothy and Margaret laughing at something in the other room came through the wall, warm and bright, and Hayes and Grace sat in the kitchen with the truth between them, not trying to change it or soften it, just sitting with it the way you have to sit with things that don't have another option. "I need to get some things in order," Hayes said. "I've been slow about it because getting things in order feels like agreeing that it's ending. But I'm done being slow." He looked at her. "I'm going to call Thomas Greer, he's my estate lawyer, this week. There are things I want to make sure are right before—" He stopped. "Before they can't be made right anymore. Does Richard know how serious it is?" Hayes looked at her steadily. "Richard knows what I choose to tell him. And what have you chosen to tell him?" "Not this," Hayes said. "Not yet." Grace thought about that answer for a long time after he left. She thought about it through the afternoon, when the stack of bills was still on the table, and the prescription still needed paying, and the job was gone. She thought about it when her mother came into the kitchen and sat down across from her and took her hand without saying anything, the way mothers do when words are beside the point. "I like him," Dorothy said finally. "I know." "Not the way those Facebook people think," her mother said. "I mean, I like who he is. I like who you are when you're around him." She squeezed Grace's hand. "You're lighter. You've been carrying everything so long you forgot what lighter felt like." Grace looked at her mother, at the lines in her face and the brightness still alive in her eyes after everything. "He's dying, Mama," she said. Dorothy didn't flinch. "I know, baby. I could see it. And when he's gone—" "When he's gone," Dorothy said firmly, "you will still be the woman you've been becoming. That doesn't go with him." Grace pressed her mother's hand to the side of her face and closed her eyes and breathed. Outside, the heat sat heavy on the whole town, on every roof and road and field, pressing down on everything it touched. 3 days later, Hayes collapsed on the floor of his ranch house at 11:30 in the morning alone. And it was the housekeeper who found him and called the ambulance. And by the time Grace heard about it, through Delia, who heard it from Roy, who heard it from a ranch hand who'd come into the diner for lunch. Hayes was already at County General, and Richard Hayes was already in the building, and the door to the room was already closed. Grace drove to that hospital in her mother's Civic with the windows down, and the July heat pouring in, and she sat in the parking lot for a long time, because she didn't know if she had the right to walk through those doors, and she didn't know what she would find if she did. And she didn't know whether the things Hayes had said to Thomas Greer the week before had been said in time. She knew only one thing with absolute certainty, as she sat in that parking lot holding the steering wheel with both hands while the sun beat down on everything in sight. Whatever happened next, she was not going to drive away. She walked through those hospital doors. It was not a small thing. Every instinct she had, 6 years of stepping aside, of taking the back entrance, of making herself easy to overlook, told her to stay in the parking lot. To wait for news that would come to her second or third hand, the way news always did in this town. To not make it harder than it already was. She walked through those doors anyway. The woman at the front desk told her Hayes was on the 3rd floor. She took the elevator. When the doors opened, Richard Hayes was standing in the corridor 20 feet away, talking to a man in a suit, and he saw her the moment she stepped out. His face did something fast and ugly. "You need to leave," he said. He was already moving toward her. "I came to see how he is," Grace said. "I don't care why you came. You're not family. You have no business being here." He stopped 3 feet in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion under the anger, the genuine fear of a son who had nearly lost his father that morning and didn't know what to do with it except push it outward. "Go home, Miss Miller." "Richard." Margaret's voice came from down the corridor, quiet but carrying. She appeared from around the corner of the nurse's station with a paper coffee cup in each hand and an expression that said she had anticipated exactly this moment. "Stop it." "She has no right to be here, Margaret." "She has every right to be here. He's been asking for her for the last 2 hours. Margaret walked past her brother and stood beside Grace in a way that was not accidental. "He's stable. They've got him on monitors, got his medication adjusted. He's awake and he's talking, and the first thing he said when he could talk was Grace's name." She looked at Richard. "So either you let her go in, or you explain to Dad why you didn't." The silence in that corridor had weight to it. Richard looked at his sister, then at Grace. Then he stepped back, not gracefully, not willingly, but he stepped back. "This isn't over," he said to Grace. "You keep saying that," Grace said quietly, and she followed Margaret down the corridor. Hayes looked smaller in a hospital bed. That was the first thing Grace registered, not the monitors or the IV or any of it, but the way a man who had seemed to fill every room he walked into had been reduced by 24 hours of crisis to something that looked fragile and tired and very old. But his eyes were the same. When she came through the door, they found her immediately, and something in them went quiet and relieved in a way that undid her completely, though she kept her face steady. "You came," he said. His voice was rough. "You keep being surprised by that," she said. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like my heart tried to quit on me and I talked it out of it." He almost smiled. "For now." "For now is enough," Grace said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I talked to Thomas Greer on Monday. You know that." "I know. What I didn't tell you is that I've been talking to Thomas for the last 2 months." His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man making sure every word lands where he intends it. "There are things I've set in motion, Grace. Things that can't be undone now, and that I don't want undone." He paused. "When the time comes, and I think we both know it's coming sooner than either of us wants to say out loud, there are going to be people who are very angry." Grace's chest tightened. "Walter, I need you to hear this." His eyes held hers. "I need you to be ready for it. Not because I think you can't handle it. Lord knows I've watched you handle more than most people twice your size and character could manage, but because it's going to come fast and it's going to come hard, and I won't be there to stand beside you when it does." "What did you do?" she said softly. "What was right," he said, simply, completely. What Eleanor would have done if she'd had more time. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the chair, and his grip was still strong, still the hands of a man who had built things. "You're going to be all right. Whatever they say. Whatever they do. You are going to be all right." She did not cry in that room. She made herself a promise about that, and she kept it. She stayed for an hour. Margaret came in twice, once to bring Grace a coffee she hadn't asked for, but needed once to tell them both that Richard had gone to get dinner and the floor was quieter. Hayes drifted in and out of alertness the way people do when their body is reclaiming energy it desperately needs, and Grace sat with him through both the talking and the silence, and when she finally left, it was because a nurse came in and the monitors needed checking, and Hayes's eyes had stayed closed for 20 minutes. She stopped at the door and looked back at him. He looked peaceful in the way of a man who has made his decisions and finished carrying the weight of them. She drove home through the dark. He died 9 days later. It was Margaret who called at 6:40 in the morning on a Thursday before Grace's alarm had gone off. Grace picked up the phone and heard the quality of Margaret's silence before she heard the words, and she sat up in bed and pressed the phone to her ear and listened. "It was quiet," Margaret said. "He went in his sleep. The night nurse checked on him at 5:30, and he was just gone. Peaceful." Her voice caught slightly. "He looked peaceful, Grace. I need you to know that." Grace sat in the dark of her bedroom for a long time after the call ended. She did not move for several minutes. Then she got up and put her mother's pills on the nightstand and poured the glass of water, and her mother appeared in the doorway in her housecoat, with her eyes already knowing. "Walter," Dorothy said. "Yes," Grace said. Dorothy crossed the room and put her arms around her daughter, and Grace stood in the middle of her kitchen and let herself be held, and the thing that came out of her was not quite crying and not quite anything else, just a release of something that had been held very carefully for a very long time, and now had nowhere left to be contained. She wore the simple black dress to the reading of the will. She had one good black dress. She'd bought it 3 years ago for a funeral, and she pressed it carefully the night before and drove to Thomas Greer's office on the edge of town at 10 in the morning, not knowing entirely why she'd been asked to come, only that Thomas had called her directly and asked her to be there. The conference room was full when she arrived. Richard sat at one end of the table with his wife and their lawyer. 2 of Hayes's other adult grandchildren were there, people Grace had never met, who looked at her with open curiosity and unconcealed discomfort. Margaret sat to one side, hands folded, expression unreadable. 3 ranch managers Grace recognized from the diner sat along the wall. When Grace walked in, the room did not go quiet so much as recalibrate. She felt every pair of eyes, and she made herself walk to the empty chair near Margaret and sit down without hurrying, without apologizing for her presence, without being small. Thomas Greer was a careful man, thin, precise, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered both good and terrible news to enough families to know that his job was accuracy, not comfort. He opened the folder in front of him and began. There were smaller bequests first. The ranch managers received specific amounts. A scholarship fund for the county high school. Donations to 3 local organizations, including the volunteer fire station with Hayes's name on the plaque. Richard and the other children received portions of several financial accounts, significant amounts, amounts that should have satisfied that by any reasonable measure were generous. Then Thomas Greer paused. He turned a page. He looked up briefly, not at Richard, not at the grandchildren, but at Grace, with the composed expression of a man about to do something he knows will cause an eruption and has steeled himself for it. "The Hayes Ranch property," he read, "including the main house, all outbuildings, the full land acreage of 4,200 acres, the cattle operation in its entirety, all associated mineral rights and oil lease agreements, and the deed of primary ownership, is to be transferred in full to Grace Ellen Miller of Mill Haven, Texas." The room detonated. Richard was on his feet before Thomas finished the sentence. "That is not—" He stopped. Restarted. "That is not legally, you cannot—" He turned to his own lawyer, who was already leaning in, and then turned back to Thomas with something that had gone past anger into a kind of white, shaking disbelief. She manipulated him. She spent weeks, months working on a sick, grieving old man who didn't know. "Mr. Hayes was of entirely sound mind," Thomas said. He did not raise his voice. "The will was witnessed, notarized, and recorded under conditions that will withstand any legal challenge, which I say not as a prediction, but as a certainty, because your father anticipated this response and was very thorough." "She's a waitress," one of the grandchildren said. Not meanly, almost bewildered, the voice of someone whose understanding of the world has just had a large piece removed without warning. "She's a waitress from the diner. She's not family." "She was the only person," Margaret said, and her voice came out sharp and clear and final, in the way of someone who has been quiet for too long. "Who sat with him when he was sick. Who talked to him like he still mattered. Who came to that hospital not for the will, not for the ranch, not for a single thing he owned, but because she gave a damn about him as a person." She looked around the table. "How many of us can say that honestly?" Silence. A different kind of silence than before. Thomas cleared his throat. "There is one additional item," he said. He reached into the folder and produced a small recorder. He set it on the table. Richard started to speak, and Margaret put her hand up, and Richard, for reasons he probably couldn't have fully explained, stopped. Thomas pressed play. Hayes's voice filled the room. Even recorded, even through the slight static of the recording, it was completely his, the unhurried gravity of it, the absolute lack of performance. "I know what this room looks like right now," Hayes said. "I know what people are saying, and what they'll keep saying after I'm gone. I've known my whole life that people see what they expect to see and call it the truth. They saw Grace Miller's weight. I saw her soul. They saw a woman taking advantage. I saw the only person in my life in 14 months who asked how I was doing and meant it and waited for the real answer. I have built things in my life. I have earned things. And I have the right to give what I built and earned to the person I believe will use it to add something good to this world." A pause. "Grace, if you're hearing this, and I know you're sitting there in that black dress trying not to show anyone what you're feeling, I need you to know that I wasn't lonely at the end. Not once you started coming around. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing." The recorder clicked off. The room was absolutely still. Then Richard pushed back from the table and walked out, and the door closed behind him. And what was left in that conference room was something that had the quality of aftermath. The particular quiet that follows something that cannot be taken back. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was aware that Margaret was watching her. She was aware that the grandchildren were looking at each other. She was aware that her own breathing had gone shallow, and that she was working very hard to keep her face composed, because Hayes had known exactly what he was doing when he said the part about the black dress, and he had known it would be the thing that finally broke through. She held it together until she got to her car. She sat in the parking lot of Thomas Greer's office and put both hands on the steering wheel and let out a long, slow, unsteady breath, and then another, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and stayed like that until the shaking stopped. By that evening, the story was everywhere. She didn't see the initial posts. She found out the way she'd found out about the first video through Delia, who called at 7:30 with a voice that had fury in it and worry underneath. "It's bad, Grace. They're calling you a gold digger, a predator, worse things than that." Someone posted the recording from the conference room. I don't know who had a phone on, somebody did, and the comments, "Don't read me the comments," Grace said. "Grace? Delia, I mean it, don't." She put the phone down. She sat at her kitchen table with the bills and the notepad and the circled prescription cost, and her mother came in and sat across from her and looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "What are you going to do?" Dorothy said. Grace looked at the table. She thought about Eleanor's garden stakes still in the ground. She thought about Hayes's hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She thought about a boy with a paper cup in the side alley of a diner, where she no longer worked, holding it with both hands, the way you hold something precious. "I'm going to sleep," Grace said, "and tomorrow I'm going to call Thomas Greer, and then I'm going to figure out what comes next." Dorothy nodded. "Good. Mama." Grace looked at her. "It's going to be bad for a while. The things they're saying. The things they're going to keep saying. I know. You're going to hear things about me that are going to make you angry. Grace Ellen Miller." Her mother's voice was absolutely even. "I was angry the first day this town decided you weren't worth seeing clearly. I've had 6 years to practice. I can handle whatever's coming." Grace looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she nodded, once pushed back from the table, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and heard Hayes's recorded voice again in the quiet of her mind, and she pressed her hand flat against her chest, where the ache of missing him had already taken up permanent residence, and she breathed through it, and she did not let it swallow her. She had too much to do. He had known that when he left it to her. He had counted on exactly that. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand at 11:15. She almost didn't look. Then she reached for it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. "This is Richard Hayes. I want you to know that I am filing a legal challenge first thing Monday morning. My father was not in his right mind, and what you did to this family is something I intend to prove. Whatever he thought you were to him, you were a stranger 8 weeks ago. Don't get comfortable." Grace read it twice. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. In the morning, she thought, she would deal with all of it in the morning. Tonight she would sleep, and the ranch would still be hers when she woke up, and Hayes's voice would still be on that recording, and whatever Richard Hayes intended to prove on Monday would have to wait for the woman Grace Miller was becoming the one Hayes had seen before she'd fully seen it herself. She closed her eyes. Outside Millhaven hummed with the story of her. Phones lit up with her name, with screenshots, with opinions delivered by people who had never once sat across a table from her in their lives. The town that had always found her easy to overlook was now looking at nothing else. Let them look, Grace thought. Let them all look. She slept. Monday morning came the way Monday mornings always come, indifferent to whatever you survived over the weekend, expecting you to show up anyway. Grace showed up. She was sitting in Thomas Greer's office at 8:45 when Richard's lawyer filed the legal challenge across town, and Thomas put his phone down and looked at her with that practiced neutrality of his and said, "It's done. They've filed." "What happens now?" Grace said. "Now we respond." He folded his hands on the desk. "I want to be very clear with you, Grace. Your father, Walter, was meticulous. We recorded 2 separate competency evaluations conducted by independent physicians in the 6 weeks before his death. We have signed witness statements from Margaret, from 2 ranch managers, from his cardiologist. We have a documented timeline of his decision-making process going back 8 weeks. He paused. Richard's lawyer is going to make noise. That's what he's paid to do. But the foundation of this challenge is going to collapse the moment it reaches a judge who reads the actual file. How long? Grace said. Weeks, not months. Walter made sure of that too. Grace looked at the desk. He planned for all of this. He planned for every single thing, Thomas said. And there was something in his voice, not sentiment exactly, but the closest a careful man like Thomas Greer came to it. He told me he wanted you to be able to move forward without spending years in a courtroom. He said, Thomas paused, looked down at a note on his desk. He said, and I'm quoting directly, she's spent enough of her life waiting for other people to stop blocking the door. Make sure the door is open. Grace pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Then let's get to work, she said. The challenge collapsed in 19 days. Not with drama. Not with a courtroom showdown. Just a letter from the judge's office that Thomas called her about on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had done their job exactly right. The competency documentation was unassailable. The witness record was airtight. Richard's lawyer had argued emotional manipulation, and the judge had found precisely 0 legal evidence to support the claim, and said so in language that left no room for a second attempt. Grace was standing in their mother's kitchen when Thomas called. She was holding a dish towel. She stood very still through the entire call, and when it ended she set the phone on the counter, and Dorothy came in from the living room and looked at her face and said, Well, it's done, Grace said. It's mine. Dorothy sat down hard in the kitchen chair. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Walter Hayes was a good man. The best I've known, Grace said, since Daddy. Dorothy looked up at her daughter. Her eyes were bright and fierce and full of everything a mother accumulates over 30-some years of watching her child be underestimated by a world that didn't know any better. Then you go do right by what he left you, she said. You hear me? You go do it right. Yes, ma'am, Grace said. That's exactly what I intend. She moved to the ranch 3 weeks later. She did it quietly without announcement, loading her car twice with the things that mattered. Her mother's medications, the good photograph of her father that lived on the dresser, the notepad where she'd written down Eleanor's garden plan modifications in blue ink, and driving out the gravel road and the dirt road, and through the gate that now had her name on the deed behind it. She stood in the main house and listened to it breathe, the way houses do when someone new comes into them adjusting. She thought about Hayes eating breakfast alone in this kitchen after Eleanor died. She thought about the sound of a silence that isn't yours. She thought about 4,200 acres of Texas land with Eleanor's garden stakes still in the ground waiting. All right, she said to the empty room, let's get to work. She hired Delia's brother-in-law. First he knew cattle, and he needed the work, and he didn't ask her a single uncomfortable question, just shook her hand and said, "When do you want me to start?" The two ranch managers, who had sat along the wall at the will reading, both came to her separately, within the first week, hats in hand, uncertain of their standing. She told them both the same thing: she needed people who knew this land better than she did, and she wasn't too proud to be taught. Both of them stayed. She was walking the garden plot on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after moving in, checking the stakes and deciding which section to break ground on, first when she heard a truck slow down on the road outside the fence. She didn't look up immediately. People had been driving past slowly, since the story broke, some curious, some hostile, some local news cameras that she declined to speak to, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years being looked at without being seen. But this truck stopped. And then the gate opened and she heard footsteps on the gravel, and when she turned around, it was Carson Webb. She waited. He stopped 10 feet away with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, the way men do when they are working up to something they don't know how to say. "I heard you're starting Eleanor's garden," he said finally. "I am. She talked about that project for years. Used to come into the diner, different diner before your time, and talk about what she wanted to grow." He looked at the stakes. "I've got a tractor with a tilling attachment sitting idle right now, and my son knows irrigation systems." He met her eyes, not comfortably, not easily, but directly. "We could come out Saturday, if you want the help." Grace looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had called her Big Grace for 6 years without a second thought. This was the man whose wife had blocked her path in the diner and called her a predator. She felt all of that. She let herself feel it. Then she said, 8 o'clock Saturday. I'll have coffee ready." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked back to his truck, and Grace watched him go, and somewhere in her chest, something complicated and necessary happened. The breakthrough didn't come from a single moment. It came the way real change comes slowly, then all at once. It started with the garden. By the end of September, the first sections were planted. By October, when the worst of the Texas heat had finally broken its grip, there were rows of vegetables coming up in the ground that Eleanor Hayes had planned and Grace Miller had built, and the sight of them, green and real and exactly where they were supposed to be, undid Grace in a way the will reading hadn't, in a way the legal victory hadn't. She stood in the middle of that garden one morning and put her hand on a tomato stake and cried silently for about 90 seconds. Then she wiped her face and went to find Delia's brother-in-law to ask about the drip system. She found the boy in late October. She had been in town at the hardware store when she saw him, not in the diner alley this time, but sitting on the bus stop bench with a woman who had to be his mother and 2 smaller children and a suitcase that told its own entire story. Grace stopped on the sidewalk, and the boy looked up, and recognition moved across both their faces at the same moment. "You're the lady from the diner," he said. "I am," Grace said. "Are you all right?" The mother looked up. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing a crisis for long enough that tired has become her resting state. "We're fine," she said with the automatic dignity of a woman who has learned to say that regardless of evidence. "Where are you staying?" Grace said. A pause. Long enough to answer the question without words. Grace looked at the mother, at the boy, at the 2 smaller children who were looking at her with the same guarded, hopeful eyes the boy had had over that paper cup in the diner alley on a July morning that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "I've got a bunkhouse that's sitting empty," Grace said, "and more work than I can pay people enough for right now. If you're willing to work, I'm willing to provide a place to stay, and a fair wage, and 3 meals a day." She looked at the mother directly. "That's a real offer. Not charity. Work." The mother looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "My name is Sandra. This is Marcus." She put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "When would you need us?" "Today works," Grace said. Sandra and Marcus and the 2 little ones moved into the bunkhouse that afternoon, and Marcus turned out to have an instinct for the garden that made Grace's chest ache with something she eventually identified as joy. The clean, unqualified kind that you stop expecting after a certain number of years. And then one day, it's just there, growing in rows in the Texas dirt. By November, there were 3 more families. Grace didn't make an announcement. She didn't hold a press conference or talk to the news cameras that still occasionally appeared at the gate. She simply made room in the bunkhouse, in the work roster, in the kitchen table that had always been too large for one person. The word spread the way word spreads among people who need things and trust each other more than they trust institutions, quietly, specifically person to person. By December, Patricia Webb showed up at the gate. Grace was coming out of the equipment barn when she saw the car. She recognized it immediately. She stopped walking. Patricia got out of the driver's side and stood beside the car and looked at Grace across the distance between them, with an expression that Grace had never seen on her face before, uncertain, stripped of its usual performance. "I heard what you're doing out here," Patricia said when Grace was close enough to hear without shouting. "For the families." "Word gets around," Grace said. "I wanted to." Patricia stopped. She looked down at her hands and then back up. "My sister lost her job in September. She's got 2 kids and her husband left and she's been staying with us, but we don't have the room long term, and I didn't know." She stopped again. "I didn't know who else to ask." Grace looked at her for a long, steady moment. Patricia Webb, who had called her a predator, who had talked about her in the pharmacy aisle like she was a specimen, who had made years of silence into a specific kind of weapon. "What's your sister's name?" Grace said. Patricia blinked. "Carolyn. Tell Carolyn to come out Thursday. We've got a cabin coming free, and I need someone who can manage the kitchen schedule for the families we've got coming in." Grace held Patricia's gaze. "Can she cook?" Patricia's voice faltered slightly. "Yes, she can cook." "Thursday," Grace said, 8 o'clock. She walked back toward the house without waiting to see Patricia's expression. But she heard the car door close, and then she heard something she hadn't expected, a sound that was almost but not quite composed, that escaped through the gap between dignity and relief, and she kept walking and gave Patricia Webb the privacy of falling apart in a driveway without an audience. Because that was the thing about Grace, the quality, not just the name. It cost you something real, but it also gave something back that nothing else could. The celebration was Margaret's idea. "Dad's birthday is February 9th, she said on the phone with Grace in January. "I think we should do something at the ranch, something that lets people see what you've built." She paused. "And I think we should put his name on it properly, whatever you've decided to call it. Hayes and Grace Haven," Grace said. She had known the name for months. It had never felt like a decision so much as a recognition of something that had always been true. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "He would have hated that." "I know. He would have said, 'Put your name first.'" "I know that too." Grace smiled. "But it's my ranch, and I get to decide and he doesn't get a vote anymore." Margaret laughed. It was a sound that sounded like her father's laugh, the same quality to it, the same surprise underneath. "All right," she said. "February 9th. February 9th came cold and clear, the kind of winter day Texas occasionally produces to prove it can, sharp and bright, with a wind that had teeth in it. The ranch was full of people. Families who had come through the program, local volunteers who had started showing up in November when the story shifted from gold-digging waitress to something the town didn't quite have a word for yet. Delia was there with her husband. Thomas Greer stood near the fence with a coffee. Margaret stood beside Grace at the front, and even 2 of the grandchildren had driven in, standing a little awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, with the expressions of people who are in the process of revising something they had thought was settled. Richard came. Grace saw him arrive, his truck pulling in through the gate, parking at the back of the lot, Richard getting out and standing there with his hands in his pockets, not approaching, just present. Something had changed in his face since the courthouse. Not softened exactly, more like weathered. Like a man who had spent several months being wrong about something important and was still working out what that cost him. He didn't speak to her, not then, but he stayed for the whole thing, standing at the back of the crowd, while Marcus and the other kids held the rope on the new sign, while Margaret said a few words about her father, while Grace stood in front of everyone who had called her worthless and damaged and a predator and a burden and spoke. She hadn't prepared much. She knew what she wanted to say, and she said it. "Walter Hayes saw something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself," she said. "Not my potential, not some future version of me that was easier to love, just me. As I actually was, on a regular Tuesday morning with a coffee pot in my hand." She looked out at the crowd, at Marcus, who was grinning at the rope, at Sandra, who had her youngest on her hip, at Delia, whose eyes were doing what Delia's eyes always did when she was trying not to cry, at Patricia Webb, who stood near the middle of the crowd looking at her feet. He didn't fix my life. He didn't rescue me. He just saw me. And it turned out that was the thing I needed most. Not money, not a ranch, not any of it. She paused. "So, if you're looking for what Walter left me, the most important thing, it wasn't the deed. It was the reminder that I was worth being seen clearly. I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure everyone who comes through that gate gets the same thing." Marcus and 2 other kids let the rope go. The sign came down, and the new one was there. Hayes and Grace Haven, painted in clean letters. Walter's name first, the way she'd decided it should be, and the crowd applauded. And in the middle of the applause, Grace looked to the back of the crowd and found Richard Hayes. He was not applauding. He was just standing there looking at the sign with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he looked at her, and he gave one slow, deliberate nod, not an apology, not a concession, but an acknowledgement. The kind a man gives when he has finally stopped fighting the truth of something and is learning to stand next to it instead. Grace nodded back, once, and then she turned to Margaret and said, "Your father would have complained about the cold." And Margaret said, "He complained about the cold every February for 80 years. And they both laughed, and the sound of it went up into the sharp Texas winter air and stayed there. Her mother found her an hour later, standing at the edge of Eleanor's garden. The plants were dormant, now pulled back into the earth for winter. But the structure was there, the irrigation lines, the beds, the rows that would come back green in March. Dorothy stood beside her daughter and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. "I want to go to Tennessee in the spring," Dorothy said finally. Grace looked at her. "Yeah, the trees. I want to see them before—" She stopped, started again. "I want to see them while I still can." "Then we'll go," Grace said. "Soon as the first planting is done." Dorothy took her daughter's hand. They stood there together at the edge of a garden that a woman named Eleanor had dreamed, and a woman named Grace had built on land that had changed hands in a way this town was still slowly learning to understand. Later that night, after the last car had left and the ranch was quiet and her mother was asleep in the room down the hall that now had east-facing windows and better light than anywhere Grace had ever lived, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. She sat in the silence of a house that was full of presence even when it was empty. The silence of a place that had been chosen, that had been made into something on purpose, that held the weight of every person who had passed through it and left something real behind. She thought about 6 years of 4:45 in the morning. About bills on a table and a broken car, AC and the pharmacy aisle and the Facebook comments she had never let herself read past the first few. She thought about a man putting $40 on a counter for a $12 meal. About a recorder playing in a conference room full of people who had expected to inherit a fortune and received instead the far more uncomfortable gift of being required to think about who they actually were. She thought about what her mother had said the morning Hayes died, that doesn't go with him. And she understood now in a way she hadn't quite understood then that her mother had been exactly right. Grace Miller picked up her cold coffee. She held it in both hands the way Hayes had always held his wrapped completely, as if the warmth of the thing was worth protecting even after it was gone. She had built something real from the wreckage of everything this town had decided about her. She had done it without revenge, without cruelty, without becoming any of the things they had accused her of being. She had done it because a man she had known for 8 weeks had looked at her on a Tuesday morning and decided she was worth seeing clearly, and she had taken that single simple radical act of being truly seen and turned it into 4,000 acres of proof. The people who judge the loudest, Hayes had said, are often the ones who understand love the least. Grace Miller put down her cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to sleep in the house that was hers. Not because she had taken it, not because she had manipulated or maneuvered or deceived anyone to get it, but because one good man had understood at the end of his life that the greatest thing he could do with what he'd built was put it in the hands of someone who would use it to build something greater. And that was exactly what she did.